Thank you all and welcome to this day 2 of the On the Margins conference. This is our second keynote address, and it's delivered to us today by Dr. Colin Harvey. Colin is a game writer and narrative designer. He co-wrote and was senior narrative designer on Blood and Truth, a virtual reality thriller, and he's previously worked on the Sniper Elite franchise for Rebellion, as well as writing licensed tie-in material for the official Doctor Who and Highlander ranges, writing short fiction for Black Library's Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, and comic stories for 2000 AD and Commando. Colin is also the author of Fantastic Transmedia, published by Palgrave in 2015, which is an academic monograph exploring transmedia storytelling in relation to large and small scale science fiction and fantasy franchises, which use the ideas of memory, effect, and play. Colin has taught digital narrative, game culture, and transmedia storytelling at institutions that include King's College London, London South Bank University, and Bournemouth University. Dr. Harvey is currently principal writer with Sabre Interactive Spain and a visiting professor with Manchester Metropolitan School of Digital Arts. And in March 2022, he wrote and presented the documentary The Origins of the Metaverse for BBC Radio 4. He's currently writing The Hero Never Dies, Storytelling in the Digital Age for Unbound Book, which is a crowdfunded project to which you can also contribute. I think that, Colin, the floor is very much yours. I'll mute and turn off my camera, and yep.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Francesca. Yes, I should preface this by saying I've got sort of flu symptoms, so apologies if I sound I don't normally sound like this, but I'm heroically going to battle my way through. And hopefully this will be kind of coherent and you know, but we can ask questions at the end. So yes, multimodal memory in game and virtual reality storytelling. This is going to be quite a kind of exploratory kind of keynote because, as Francesca was kind of indicating, so I was an academic. I'm kind of recovering academic, I guess. So for the last 8 years, I've worked kind of exclusively in the kind of games industry, but before that, I did sort of freelance stuff for the games industry and lots of other media and stuff that I can talk about. So this is who I am. I'm Dr. Colin Harvey, and as Francesca said, I'm a game writer and narrative designer. I'm also a visiting professor with the Manchester Writing School and a kind of industry advisor to the School of Digital Arts at Manchester Metropolitan University. So I think I'm fairly unusual in that I come at this from two kind of like, well, depending on your perspective, either competing or complementary kind of positions. One as a game writer, somebody kind of actively working in the games industry, but also these other allied kind of media industries. But also somebody who's got an academic kind of background and a PhD and stuff in this, a grounding in this kind of stuff, in terms of like narrative theory and a relationship between narrative theory and kind of interactivity and stuff. So yeah, as I say, it's kind of an unusual position. So these days, primarily I make my money from, my bread and butter is kind of game writing. So I'm currently lead writer with Sabre, principal writer rather. But before that, I was lead writer with Sony's PlayStation London studio, and as Francesca mentioned, I worked on Blood and Truth, which was a big kind of VR thriller, which I'll talk more about sort of later on. Sniper Elite 4, which was, you know, as you can probably tell, is a kind of World War II themed kind of sniping kind of game, open world game. And I'll also talk about that later on as well. And then other things like a kind of pulpy game called Strange Brigade, which was also produced by Rebellion, who makes Sniper Elite. And then going right the way back, I did some freelance uncredited work on a game called The Getaway Black Monday for Sony's Team Soho. Again, that's a sort of gritty kind of London-based thriller. And then a game called 8 Days, which is a bit of a kind of lost classic. It's great to have worked on a lost classic. It was never released. but there was lots of kind of, in the media were very excited about it, and there was gameplay kind of footage and stuff which you can find online. But the fact that it was never released means it is, nobody can ever critique it and say, oh, this is good or bad. And then the first game I ever worked on was the Nox trading game, which is an indie game, a bit ahead of its time, really, kind of online kind of trading and collecting and battling kind of game. And lots of other projects, which I won't mention, because that's game development, because lots of projects you spend a lot of time working on, but for various reasons won't get released. But these are the ones which have actually been published. But as I mentioned, in addition to all that stuff, which we could perhaps put in a kind of non-sequential kind of pile, and that distinction is kind of important for what I'm going to talk about, there's also this other stuff. So a range of kind of short fiction, quite a lot of kind of licensed fiction. So these are short stories, books, fairly, as you can see, often quite kind of pulpy kind of based. But yeah, so lots of licensed stuff around things like Doctor Who and Warhammer, and more recently, but also comic stuff for 2000 AD. And in fact, Sniper Elite, the Andartes thing there is a kind of prequel comic to the game that I worked on. So that's quite interesting to kind of think about the relationship between the sequential comic and the kind of non-sequential kind of open world game and the relationship between them. And then things like Judge Dredd, Highlander, kind of audio stuff I do as well. And as Francesca mentioned, I also did a thing for Radio 4, documentary for Radio 4 about the origins of the metaverse from the point of view of world building, which is still on the BBC website, so you can go and listen to that if you're interested, but also academic writing, so about Grand Theft Auto, and more recently, as Francesca mentioned, the book Fantastic Transmedia, which is published by Palgrave and is an analysis of kind of cross-media storytelling in sort of science fiction and fantasy stories. And that last thing about transmedia is kind of important to what I want to kind of think about today, really. Because I would say my experience of the kind of the games industry is that increasingly there is a transmedia imperative. So there's a kind of need to conceive connected story worlds that kind of spread into kind of multiple media. And there are lots of obvious examples, very big kind of examples of this, from Star Wars to Marvel to Doctor Who to so this is and there's a real kind of push within the kind of the industry, but also within these kind of related industries to kind of move towards kind of a shared kind of cross-media story worlds. And with the kind of the academic part of my kind of brain, I'm kind of thinking, well, actually, it would be really helpful then if we could kind of establish a framework for the creation and analysis of both digital and non-digital, sequential and non-sequential storytelling forms. So really, as I say, this is a very exploratory keynote, but that's really, I guess, the kind of the high level kind of question I'm kind of posing here, really. And I'll take you through, because I'm aware that not everybody's got a grounding in kind of game studies or necessarily kind of narrative theory. So I'll take you through some of the key kind of perspectives on these kind of issues. And the thing that unites them is really this idea of kind of memory. So and let's begin with this kind of image here. Which is a kind of, at face value is kind of, I guess, a kind of interesting, dynamic kind of interest of the car on a racing car, with the trees and the kind of sun dappling through the kind of the trees. But if you stop and think about it, it's a kind of peculiar kind of thing, really, because this is a computer game, it's a video game, it's not a movie, and there's something about this image which is kind of strange when you kind of view it in that way, which is it's the sunlight kind of coming through. It's the kind of that strange kind of like that artifact. That's the kind of flaw that's produced within a camera. But of course, in a video game, there is no camera, so it's emulating this other kind of media, and it's therefore from the perspective I'm taking in this keynote, it's kind of remembering that other kind of media, and that's what I'm really interested in today. Is to kind of think about what the multiple ways in which games use memory and VR use kind of memory, but also that relationship to these other kind of sequential media that I kind of mentioned before. So there's what I'm going to talk about. Subjective and collective memory in games, academic and industry approaches to game storytelling, and VR storytelling, memory and the grammar of the game, memory and the grammar of virtual reality, and then a few conclusions to kind of like, and these are just really kind of serving suggestions as to ideas, things we might think about beyond that point. So let's start. And I bet, you know, you come to a keynote on games, you probably don't expect to start with Spinoza, but let's do that. I like to kind of mix it up like that. So Spinoza said in Ethics, he said, for there is something else that I want to be noted here first of all, namely that we can do nothing from a decree of mind unless we can recollect it. So really, I'm interested in this because it's this idea that memory is central to kind of all human activity when you think about it. Spinoza is kind of useful if you're taking a kind of affective kind of position, as I've done in my kind of academic kind of writing, because actually I think a lot of what Spinoza is talking about in terms of, he talks about variations of capacity and kind of like how the human body is kind of in flux, and that fits quite neatly with kind of like kind of neuroscience and kind of their understanding of kind of the brain, the relationship to the kind of the body and stuff. So there's I won't talk too much about this now, but there's the thing around the mind body kind of, you know, Cartesian dualism and all that kind of stuff is kind of embedded in this kind of idea really. But Spinoza kind of offers a way through that, and so he's proven very influential on people like kind of Antonio Damasio and stuff kind of going forwards. So yeah, so memory is a kind of central kind of idea. So let's begin. So I'll provide, as I say, a little bit of kind of autobiographical memory to begin with. So this is, so context. In 1983, when I was aged 11, I won a computer, the computer that's kind of depicted in that image there, which was an Atari 800. And the competition actually was a Daily Express competition in collaboration with a high street retailer called Lasky's. And the competition was to design a house of the future, and you know, the school entered it, and each Friday we would kind of design a different room in the house. Anyway, I did quite well in the competition, and I was a runner-up and was given this computer. And this is 1983. We weren't a particularly kind of wealthy kind of family. Nobody we knew had a computer, so we ended up being weirdly kind of early adopters of this kind of technology. And it kind of entered into our kind of house and got plugged into our kind of rental kind of DER kind of television set. So, and this image is the kind of the middle class father with a tie and kind of jumper, kind of helping his son with the kind of maths, is the image from the front cover of the Atari manual that kind of came with the computer. This is what my actual family kind of looked like. That's me on the left with a football, the only known picture of me ever holding a football. And beside me is my nephew, who will be 40 next year. So that shows you how long ago this was. There's my mum and there's my dad with a cigarette, because he always had a cigarette. And because this computer that we owned, that I'd won, the disk drive that we got with it never worked. So I would kind of type things into the computer from the manual, like a kind of Stars and Stripes program or a kind of like a jazz score or whatever. And then the family would have to kind of gather around and kind of watch me as I demonstrated it, because as soon as you turned it off, it disappeared forever. So it became this very kind of performative act amidst this kind of the fog of kind of cigarette smoke in the kind of the lounge. But this stuff is, you know, obviously quite, you know, in terms of the relationship between kind of subjective and kind of collective memory is kind of like useful to kind of think about, I think. So here's that computer again. So the Atari 800, and then the first game I ever owned. So I wasn't doing my maths homework on it. I was playing video games, but video games were very expensive. So this was the first game I owned and the only game I owned for a long time. And it came in a cartridge. So the materiality is kind of important to think about as well. And then you would kind of open the hatch on the top of the computer and you could insert this kind of cartridge into it. And then when the game was playing, it was kind of like a kind of space fighter, kind of Star Wars style thing, where you kind of be looking out the kind of the front viewfinder of the spaceship, and you'd have to fight these spacecraft and stuff. Now, as you can see there, you can probably just about tell that the actual images, the iconography of the spaceships looks awfully similar to the TIE fighters from Star Wars. And in fact, the rest of the game includes references, you know, other spaceships that look like things from Battlestar Galactica and other things that look like the Star Trek Enterprise. But it was never a licensed piece of work. So this was a kind of another example of kind of remembering, but it was a kind of a sort of unauthorized kind of remembering, which I talk about in the book Fantastic Transmedia. And years later, I checked this because I interviewed the guy that created it for a games magazine, a guy called Doug Neubauer, and he confirmed, oh yes, it was intended to do that, but yeah, absolutely, we didn't have any kind of licensing rights to kind of do that. So I'm not sure you'd get away with that today. But one of the things that I did get into with the computer was to experiment with kind of like creating my own text adventures. So this was the kind of the era of those original text adventures. So Infocom were a big company that kind of created things like Zork, and this one here, kind of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you're not familiar, I suspect you are probably kind of familiar with what a text adventure is. It's very similar in a way to the kind of choose your own adventure books, which were also popular in that period. So you'd say, you know, you'd be standing in a glade, and the game or the book would say, you know, do you want to go north or south? And by typing in north or south or turning to the right page, it would take you down a kind of branching kind of narrative. Anyone who's created a branching narrative knows that they're incredibly challenging to kind of create, because you end up with kind of proliferating kind of branches each time. So it could become unmanageable very quickly. So you have to kind of find ways of dovetailing the kind of the branches kind of back in. But one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about the computer, which, you know, and I was never a very good programmer, but I kind of, you know, learned some extremely basic kind of stuff about assigning variables. And I found it really interesting that you could, for instance, you could say, you come across a sword, do you want to take the sword? And if you take the sword, sword equals 1. But if you choose not to take the sword, then in the program, sword equals 0. So that later on, so you do that kind of setup, and then later on you have a kind of payoff whereby you say, you know, you encounter a bellicose dragon, and if you have the sword, then you can use the sword because sword equals 1. But if you don't have the sword because sword equals 0, then the dragon will kill you. But that sort of thing, I found that really interesting from quite a kind of early, because I was very interested in creative writing, and it's from an early age, this potential for kind of interactive narrative. And it seemed to me that actually from the stories I was doing at school and stuff, that actually that was a useful kind of point of kind of analogy between setting up an idea and then paying off the idea within the story. And then later on, when I got to university and I studied screenwriting as part of my undergraduate degree, I studied Robert McKee, who you may or may not be familiar with, but is a kind of slightly cantankerous, well, very cantankerous kind of screenwriting theorist who wrote a book called Story, and he does these kind of lectures for wannabe screenwriters. And he talks about setups in this way. He says, to express our vision, scene by scene, we crack open the surface of our fictional reality and send the audience back to gain insight. These insights, therefore, must be shaped into setups and payoffs. To set up means to layer in knowledge. To pay off means to close the gap by delivering that knowledge to the audience. When the gap between expectation and result propels the audience back through the story seeking answers, it can only find them if the writer has prepared or planted these insights in the work. So, you know, sword equals 1 or sword equals 0 is not, you know, I would say there has to be a kind of ironic charge when you kind of establish an idea, and then, you know, that there's a gun in the drawer, and then later on that gun gets used. But you kind of got to do it in a kind of clever way, which makes your audience think, oh yeah, I remember now, you know. So again, so this is another form of remembering. It's kind of remembering within the story, and then thinking about how that, as I say, how that kind of maps onto games and kind of digital kind of storytelling is kind of interesting. So let's talk a little bit about kind of storytelling and games and computer, you know, digital narrative more broadly. So a really key kind of book for me is a very influential book for me was Janet Murray's Hamlet on the Holodeck, which I think is 25 years old this year or next year. And she says, so the computer is comedionic. It can be seen as a theatre, a town hall, and an unraveling book, an animated wonderland, a sports arena, and even a potential life form. As the most powerful representational medium yet invented, it should be put to the highest tasks of society. Whether or not we will one day be rewarded with the arrival of the cyberbard, we should hasten to place this new compositional tool as firmly as possible in the hands of the storytellers. So that's, you know, and actually that book is, I think, pretty amazing, really, and it's kind of seminal in terms of what it manages to predict in terms of both digital storytelling and all the different structures, but also in terms of transmedia storytelling. So she kind of anticipates that as well, alongside people like obviously Marcia Kinder and then later Henry Jenkins. But it's a very positivist kind of view of kind of what storytelling and what the digital kind of offers storytelling. Meanwhile, you've got this other perspective. Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. And that's John Carmack quoted in David Kushner's book about Doom, and Doom is one of the kind of key seminal kind of games. So and this kind of like this kind of these two extreme positions around the nature of storytelling and the digital and particularly games is I guess kind of been the background to my kind of entire career, both as a kind of academic studying this stuff, and then later as a writer kind of working in these kind of media. And these, you know, they're two extremely different positions, clearly, in terms of around, you know, kind of positive kind of view of what games are, or what the computer kind of offers digital storytelling, and then an extremely, you know, kind of derisory kind of throwaway kind of perspective on them. And this kind of like this argument kind of happens in different ways, I think, within both academia and the industry itself. And you can kind of see why, because if you think, well, you know, games are so diverse, and this is, I think, probably a key thing to kind of think about if we try to think of any kind of framework for how we could create stories for games and then the wider kind of transmedia sphere, is that actually it's a moving target. You know, it's kind of like it's there's the definitions of what these things constitute keep kind of changing. So on the one hand, you've got something like Pong, which is a kind of representation of a very clearly very simplistic representation of a kind of tennis match, all the way through to something like Red Dead Redemption 2, which looks very much like a movie. Interestingly, a friend of mine who's a writer in architecture sort of described games as being like a kind of an inverse history of visual art. So you kind of start off abstract with something like Pong, and then you end up highly representational with something like Red Dead Redemption, which is kind of interesting. But again, it's like so it's this thing around, certainly with Red Dead Redemption, is the you know, how it's remembering, again, like the car example I used earlier, how it's remembering kind of other media and the techniques it kind of uses. And then this question around are games stories. So when game studies kind of started in the academy as a kind of formal kind of discipline, which I would say really the kind of the big bang year is 2001, because that's when the Game Studies Journal was launched, and that's when there were a number of key kind of conferences, including one at the University of the West of England called Game Cultures. And that was the big kind of conversation, was like, well, are game stories? Because you look at something like The Last of Us and you think, well, this is a still from The Last of Us. And I think again, well, that looks entirely like a kind of movie. It looks, you know, there can be no doubt that this is a story. But then you look at something like Tetris, and Tetris is, you know, it doesn't look like a story. It kind of, you know, it doesn't obey any of the criteria of what constitutes a story, because there are no human or anthropomorphic characters. It only operates in a sort of singly temporal kind of sequence, rather than the doubly temporal sequence that the film scholar Christian Metz kind of says is kind of critical to narrative. And also, you can't, you know, you'd have trouble kind of adapting this into a kind of another medium, which some theorists say is another criteria for what constitutes narrative. So coming up with a kind of totalizing theory of games as stories is kind of problematic. You can tell a story of Tetris after the fact, but you can't, you know, it's not in of itself a kind of story, you could argue. So then we get to, and this is amongst game studies scholars, this will kind of elicit kind of groans, really, because it became the key kind of debate for quite a while. So this idea of kind of ludology. So ludology was an approach to kind of studying games, which suggested that games are a unique discipline unto themselves. They don't want to remember other kind of media. You know, they might want to remember the history of games, board games, and what that could kind of tell us about kind of video games. But they regard kind of games, ludologists regard games as kind of formal and kind of rule based, and a key thing for me is kind of experiential, as opposed to the narratology kind of position, which was arguing that actually you could just analyze games by taking existing kind of narrative theory from theatre or film or the novel and then adapt it to make it kind of work. And this was a very big kind of debate between these two kind of schools, and it was very heated at the time. And there is a case to saying that the media contributed, the games media sort of also kind of built up the kind of the made the debate more heated than it would otherwise have been. And then a key person for, I would think, for both sides of the debate really is this guy, academic Espen Aarseth, who wrote Cybertext: Perspectives on Ergodic Literature. So really, a really helpful kind of term for us is this idea of the ergodic. And he says, during the cybertextual process, the user will have effectuated a semiotic sequence, and this selective movement is a work of physical construction that the various concepts of reading do not account for. This phenomenon I call ergodic, using a term appropriated from physics that derives from the Greek words ergon and hodos, meaning work and path. In ergodic literature, non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader to traverse the text. If ergodic literature is to make sense as a concept, there must also be non-ergodic literature, where the effort to traverse the text is trivial. So this is quite a kind of critical kind of distinction between stuff that takes some effort to kind of to traverse and stuff that doesn't kind of or seem to require that kind of effort. Now, the question is, when you have a kind of transmedial story world where these things become increasingly kind of connected, how does, how does that distinction between the ergodic and the non-ergodic kind of continue? So that would be a kind of question I would kind of raise in regard to this. And then, so I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a narrative designer. This is a term that, again, like a lot of these things in terms of games and the digital generally, these things keep, as I say, these things keep kind of moving and shifting kind of definitions. So a narrative designer, each studio will have a different definition of what a narrative designer is. Sometimes they're viewed as writers, and then sometimes they're viewed much more as kind of designers. But there is a kind of spatial kind of component as to what a narrative designer might be. Stephen Deinhardt was the first narrative designer who was also an academic who moved into the industry, who was asked by THQ to kind of come up with a job description for what a narrative designer could be, wrote the job description, and then they couldn't find anyone. So in the end, they asked him to be to be their narrative designer, and he became the first kind of narrative designer. And then in putting this together, I tried to kind of, in terms of differentiating what a game writer does and what a narrative designer does, I tried to come up with a kind of a Venn diagram, and I came up with lots of, and I won't labor this too much, but so there are lots of things that you might say sit on one side, which are more in the game writing sphere, and then lots of things that sit on the other side, but then also a lot of other things that sit in the kind of the middle. And then I tried to think, well, maybe you could think of another way of thinking about these things is that game writing perhaps is more temporally kind of organized, and that narrative design is more spatially organized. But the thing is, every project I've worked on, it kind of differs. Again, there's this idea that it's a kind of shifting definition. So I ended up putting this across. So it depends on the project, basically. And then we arrive at the kind of the industry kind of idea of this thing, ludonarrative dissonance. And this is really a kind of, I would say, another version of the same debates that I mentioned with Carmack and Murray, and I mentioned in terms of the ludology narratology debate. But this has emerged within the industry in relation to it's a guy called Clive Hocking, who's a game designer, who said this about BioShock, which is an amazing game. If you ever get a kind of chance to kind of play it, still stands up very well. But he kind of argues that actually the gameplay mechanic is working against the kind of the storytelling in this kind of context. And the gameplay mechanic is really about doing everything for yourself and being completely kind of selfish, because it's exploring kind of the theories of kind of Ayn Rand as part of the, it's key kind of, you can see that in the kind of the Art Deco kind of influences. But that's within the mechanic. But then the narrative is saying, no, you're doing this, you're carrying out all these tasks for somebody else. So what he's arguing is that these two things are kind of running sort of counter to each other. And he expressed it this way. He says, to cut straight to the heart of it, BioShock seems to suffer from a powerful dissonance between what it is about a game and what it is about a story. By throwing the narrative and ludic elements of the work into opposition, the game seems to openly mock the player for having believed in the fiction of the game at all. And then another kind of obvious kind of example, because this happens a lot. So if you take a game like Uncharted, which is very kind of Indiana Jones sort of influence kind of game, about a kind of a treasure seeker called Nathan Drake, is that within the kind of gameplay kind of elements, which is this, he's often killing lots and lots of people, but within the cutscene sequences, and these are the kind of the non-interactive kind of drama kind of elements that help convey the kind of the key plot points of the story. This stuff is never mentioned. The fact that he's kind of like a mass killer, depending on what the player has done in the kind of the gameplay kind of element, is not kind of referred to. So there's this kind of, again, it's this thing about memory. So it's kind of like within the game, as a player or as a viewer, from the point of view of the cutscenes, you're being asked to forget your actions controlling the character within the kind of gameplay kind of sequences. So this is a really common example of kind of ludonarrative dissonance. The question is, of course, people tend to kind of accept it within games. So maybe it's a bit like, the genre of the musical, where people suddenly burst into song, and then in the next sequence, a dramatic sequence is happening, and then suddenly they burst into song again. But these two things are not necessarily kind of referred to within within each of those kind of elements. So, yeah. Okay, so let's move to memory and what I'm calling memory and the grammar of the game. So as at the beginning, I kind of mentioned I worked on a game called Sniper Elite 4, which is a World War II themed open world game, which is mainly based around kind of sniping. And in terms of the narrative, so this particular iteration of the game was set in Italy in World War II, and really wanted to kind of tell the story of the Allies' kind of invasion of Italy, but bringing in kind of other elements like the kind of the partisans and even the mafia, the influence of the mafia in terms of the campaign. So we drew on things like, I went to things like Operation Mincemeat, because that was quite a useful thing that we wanted to kind of look at. So if you're not aware of that story, it's the story the Allies created a kind of, they used a tramp and kind of dressed the tramp as a British officer, and then dumped the body so it would be found with all these leaflets, with all this intelligence on him. So it gave the impression to Hitler that actually the invasion would happen via Greece rather than kind of Italy. And, by all accounts, it was a kind of successful thing. So the player could stumble across a body which was kind of, on a beach, which would kind of allude to that kind of thing. And then I drew on a number of other kind of books, Sam Fuller's The Big Red One, which, in terms of like the Italian campaign, was very kind of useful. And then also we were kind of remembering things like Where Eagles Dare, and then more recent films like Brad Pitt's kind of Fury. The most influential thing was this book, The 4 Days in Naples, because because I joined the kind of project partway through, they'd already kind of designed all the kind of character models and the environments, and they wanted it to be kind of set in the south of the country because of the different kind of environments that would give them. But actually, they also wanted the partisans, but the partisans weren't active historically speaking, in the south of the country. It was really kind of the partisan activity was really from 1943 kind of onwards in the north of the country. So I had to kind of find ways around that as a kind of writer to try and kind of, as a writer specifically working in this medium, to try and kind of make this work. So what I ended up doing was drawing on 4 Days in Naples, because that was an example of the sort of people living on the streets, so homeless kids basically, who kind of rose up against the Nazis. So that felt like a kind of useful kind of point of connection to help kind of sell the idea. So yeah, as I say, it's a sort of exploratory kind of sniper-based kind of game, and you move through all these different kind of environments. As you go though, you're able to kind of pick up what we call collectible kind of documents. So you can find documents within the environment. So as well as the kind of the bigger kind of story that we're telling, there are lots of these, and it's kind of gamified. So you in order to really complete the level, you have to find each of these documents. And one of the things we included was lots of what were called last letters. So this again is historically accurate. The soldiers would write last letters to their loved ones in case they died, and then these letters would be discovered. So if you kill a character, then you would find one of these kind of letters on them. And then interestingly, I discovered sort of more recently that there's online somebody has created a kind of YouTube kind of tribute to all the letters that I've written within the game, and which is kind of peculiar really to me, because obviously I kind of created these, but it's like a little kind of almost like a kind of online kind of shrine to these kind of letters with kind of moving music behind, and then the comments are kind of like related to kind of what's in the content of the letters. So again, it's this kind of like, so then we start to get to that kind of the communal memory, the kind of collective kind of memory of these kind of events, and then people's subjective experiences of kind of playing the game, and the kind of the intersection between those things again are kind of interesting to me. And then another thing I did within the game, because budgetary reasons meant that there was one particular character's backstory, who's the guy that you see there. We weren't able to kind of finish that character's story in the main kind of storyline. So what I did was to kind of create a kind of little breadcrumb trail of those collectible documents where you could find out more about this character. And then at the end, there was a kind of in one of the climactic kind of levels, there was a battle at a kind of watermill, and the player can choose whether to kind of join the battle at the watermill to help the partisans, or whether to go on the main kind of mission. And depending on the relationship that I've hopefully kind of generated with this character, and whether the players collected all these documents, will depend on whether they choose to kind of help the partisans carry out the watermill kind of mission or not. So so it's another kind of branching, but it's a kind of very different kind of branching. And in fact, we were able to kind of put the face of one of the character from the main storyline onto one of these characters within one of the bodies within the watermill kind of sequence, to help kind of sell that kind of idea. Okay, and then very quickly, because I'm aware I don't have very much time, but I wanted also to talk about memory and the grammar of virtual reality. So this is something that I worked on much more kind of recently for Sony. It arose from an anthology of games for the Sony's VR system, which was called VR Worlds, and these included the most successful elements were really this kind of shark cage kind of thing. So you could put the headset on and go down into the kind of shark cage and kind of encounter this shark, which was quite kind of terrifying. But also a kind of dramatic kind of element, a little kind of, I think, called the London Heist, which was a kind of like, as you can see, a kind of gritty kind of gangster kind of London set melodrama, really. And because that was really quite successful, the developer, Sony PlayStation London, decided to create a much bigger version, a kind of epic kind of thing called Blood and Truth, which again is a kind of VR game with similar sort of themes, really, and influenced, again, remembering these other media. So things like The Long Good Friday and Get Carter were big kind of influences. But inevitably, we ended up back at kind of, Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. So, but also we wanted things like kind of Die Hard to kind of be in there. So it's been possible to kind of, you work your way through service ducts in the kind of virtual world, and you can kind of abseil across the kind of the Thames and stuff. And then things like Mission Impossible and obviously James Bond kind of references that are in there as well. So it ends up being, none of it's very subtle, but it's kind of, kind of quite big and kind of fun kind of action movie, like being inside the kind of the action movie. But basically, so the scene in question kind of shows a this guy on the right in this image, which is Colin Salmon, who's quite a big kind of British kind of actor, but also does kind of Hollywood kind of stuff, who's playing a kind of CIA agent, and he's interrogating you, and you're assuming this role of this sort of vaguely sort of, I don't know, Michael Caine, James Bond sort of character. And that's the character that you play, and it's a kind of interrogation kind of scene, which you've seen a million times before in kind of movies and television. And so again, it's kind of remembering, it's this kind of genre convention, it's kind of remembering, but then kind of reinterpreting it for the kind of VR kind of medium. And there's one point, in fact, the Colin Salmon, the CIA character, who kind of walks around the back of you, which in VR is quite kind of effective, but we couldn't do that very often because of the wires kind of coming out the back of the kind of VR headset, which we call kind of tethering, kind of make stuff like that kind of challenging. But and then the second scene really relates to it's a scene showing the two brothers, so the kind of main characters of the story, and their sister kind of comes into the room and kind of interrupts to give some dramatic kind of news. And what's interesting about that is because in the context of VR, you don't, unlike a movie, you can't rely on kind of editing. So in terms of scene transitions, getting from one place to another, we were always having to kind of fade down because that was the only thing that wasn't too kind of jarring for the kind of player. But one way of kind of doing a kind of a change in a scene that we discovered was, which effectively functions like a cut, is to have that character kind of coming in and issuing some sort of dramatic news or changing the drama in the scene. So in a weird way, VR and certainly the production of VR, which I could talk much more about, but is much more like theatre in some ways. And actually the actors were saying, oh, this is much more like theatre than kind of filmmaking. So there's this interesting kind of hybridity kind of going on there, I think, particularly with a medium like kind of VR, in terms of how it's remembering. So just to go back, and I appreciate there's a lot of kind of material to kind of assimilate, but just to go back to this idea that I started with. So increasingly, as I said, there's a transmedia imperative, the need to conceive connected story worlds that exist in kind of multiple kind of media. And then I asked this question: can we therefore establish a framework for the creation and analysis of both digital and non-digital, sequential and non-sequential storytelling forms? And I kind of, in terms of my own kind of practice and my own kind of research, I kind of think, well, someone you could look at who I think would be kind of instructive is Monika Fludernik, who you may or may not be kind of familiar with. But Monika Fludernik is a narratologist, and she argues that narrative at its fullest manifestation, I argue, correlates with human experientiality. And she proposes this concept of natural narratology. So this can be argued to propose the most natural approach to narrative, since it attempts to foreground human embodiment and its cognitive consequences on all levels of narrative and narrational experience. So just going right the way back to kind of Spinoza at the beginning, and my kind of whole point around kind of affectivity and experientiality, I would say that's the kind of critical thing for any kind of narrative, that actually, whether it's interactive or not, it seems to me, and there's masses of research across different disciplines which suggests this is the case, that actually all kind of engagement with storytelling is in some way kind of active, and it's finding what the nuances are in terms of each kind of discipline, really. So just as a kind of my conclusions, really. So I would say games are part of a complex network of relations in which subjective and collective memory dynamically interact. So, we see that with kind of autobiographical memory, but we saw that with kind of the example of the kind of Sniper Elite kind of examples, where somebody had gone and kind of created a kind of little tribute online to stuff that I'd made up, basically. These memories inform game creation and analysis and might be autobiographical, generic, intertextual, etc. But as I say, they're always experiential. Non-sequential game progression requires creators to manipulate memory in new ways, which I think I started to kind of allude to. in the VR example. And then games and VR remember the grammar of existing storytelling media, but must also invent new strategies. And the thing I haven't really talked about as much as I could have, but is this idea of forgetting, because you know, in the example of ludonarrative dissonance between gameplay and kind of the narrative elements, there is this kind of forgetting kind of happening. But also that applies to kind of like licensed work, when certain things from canon might be forgotten in favor of other things, or foregrounded less in other things. So memory isn't just about remembering, it's also about forgetting, and you can break that further down, I think. So any new adaptive tool for narrative creation and analysis might choose to foreground memory in its various multimodal types. And it could, in fact, build upon concepts outlined by Murray, Janet Murray, or Espen Aarseth, or Monica Fludic, as well as theories of cultural memory. So that's the big thing, kind of like joining this all together, is kind of the work being done, I think, in the field of cultural memory. And that's really the kind of conclusion of my my kind of presentation. So just to mention that the book at the beginning that was mentioned, which I'm currently working on, which is appropriately enough is a crowd-funded book from a company called Unbound, and it's all about this subject area, because I think it's I think there's lots to say, and I think there's lots of sorry, you're still seeing my image? Sorry, I think I lost you for a second there.
Yeah, we can see your image, not a problem.
Okay, cool. So the hero never dies. So if you feel like kind of coming and supporting that, that would be really great. And there's should be my Twitter handle there as well, for anybody still using Twitter. And there you go. So that's game over for me.